Could you identify a fake person in under a minute, or are you already being deceived without realizing it? Because the truth is uncomfortable, the fakest people you've ever met probably didn't seem fake at first. Quite the opposite, they seemed too right. Too interested. Too connected to you. As if, somehow, they showed up at exactly the right moment, saying exactly what you needed to hear. And that's where the problem begins. Because you don't fall for fake people due to a lack of intelligence, you fall because something in them activates a part of you that wants to believe. Wants to trust. Wants to connect. According to Carl Jung, we don't see people as they are, we see them as we are. We project onto others what exists within us, our expectations, our emotional needs, our inner voids. And that's exactly what makes falseness so hard to detect. It doesn't show up as a threat. It disguises itself as familiarity. As affinity. As identification. And while you think you're getting to know someone, often, you're just recognizing parts of yourself reflected in their behavior. Now think about it, how many times have you trusted someone too quickly just because they seemed different? How many times did you feel someone was special, only to later notice small inconsistencies you chose to ignore? It wasn't a lack of signs. It was an excess of expectation. Because fake people don't need to lie all the time, they just need to adapt to what you want to see. And they do that very well. They observe. They adjust. They mirror. They create a version of themselves that fits perfectly into your emotional world. And that creates a powerful sense of connection, a connection that isn't built, it's calculated. But here's the detail that changes everything. Fakeness isn't in what someone shows at the beginning. It's in what they can't sustain over time. Because no one can wear a mask forever. At some point, it slips. In a detail. In a reaction. In an absence. And it's exactly in those micro moments, almost invisible, that the truth starts to appear. But almost no one notices. Because they're too busy believing in the version they want to be real. And that's why you can spend years around someone, without ever truly seeing who they are. Not because they're perfect. But because you learn to ignore the signs that would pull you out of what feels comfortable. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And maybe that's exactly what's happening when you keep attracting, trusting, and getting involved with people who, deep down, were never what they seemed. It's not bad luck. It's not coincidence. There's a pattern. There's an invisible dynamic at play. And the moment you start to see it, something shifts. You begin to notice small details that used to go unnoticed. You start to feel inconsistencies before you can even explain them. You begin to understand that fakeness isn't about appearance, it's about consistency. But then comes the question that really matters. If fake people don't show who they are right away, how is it possible to identify them so quickly? Is there really a sign? Or several? And more importantly, why can some people spot it in seconds, while others take months, or even years? Because what you're about to see isn't obvious. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. And maybe that's exactly why this intrigues you so much, because deep down, you've already felt it. Even if you couldn't explain it. That strange feeling, that subtle discomfort, that detail that doesn't quite fit, but you ignore it because you want to believe everything is fine. Now tell me something, have you ever had that feeling with someone? That sense that something was off, but you couldn't quite pinpoint what? If this has happened to you, comment something simple like, I've felt this. Because when you put it out there, you start to realize it's not just you. So many people go through this, they just don't talk about it. And if this kind of content is opening your perception, if you feel like you're starting to see things you used to miss, then it's worth continuing. Hit the like button now. This helps the video reach more people who are being deceived without realizing it, people who, just like you, only need a small awakening to completely change how they see others. And if you want to develop this sharper, more conscious awareness, if you want to understand human behavior, emotional patterns, and everything no one ever explains about relationships, subscribe to the channel. Because what you're about to discover isn't just about identifying fake people, it's about never falling into the same situation again. Because there's one specific detail, almost invisible, that shows up in the first seconds of any interaction, and reveals far more than words ever could. And this detail, it's not in what the person says. It's not in carefully chosen words, or an easy smile, or the way they try to seem interesting. It appears in something much more subtle, in how the person reacts when they haven't had time to prepare. Because in the first seconds of any interaction, before the mask fully settles, there's a small window where behavior is more spontaneous than calculated. And that's exactly where everything starts to reveal itself. But here's the point almost no one notices: you don't miss this sign because it doesn't exist, you miss it because you're focused on the wrong thing. You pay attention to what the person says, when you should be observing how they behave. You analyze the content, when you should be feeling the coherence. You connect with the story, when you should be noticing the intention. And this creates a very common kind of emotional blindness. Because fake people don't expose themselves through what they show, but through what they can't sustain. According to Carl Jung, the persona, the social mask we all wear, is built to create a specific impression. And fake people master this with precision. They know how to appear trustworthy. They know how to create instant connection. They know how to make you feel special. But there's a limit. Because the persona requires effort. It requires control. It requires constant attention. And in the early moments, that control isn't fully aligned yet. That's where small cracks appear. Small misalignments. Small signals that seem insignificant, but say a lot. For example, have you ever talked to someone who seemed interested, but there was something off in their eyes? As if they were present, but not fully there? As if they were more focused on making an impression than actually connecting? Or someone who agrees with everything you say too quickly? Who seems too perfect, too aligned, without any friction, as if they're shaping their personality in real time just to fit you? That's not connection. That's strategic adaptation. And that's where one of the most important signs appears, something you can notice in less than a minute: the absence of authenticity. But pay attention, this doesn't mean the person will seem obviously fake. Quite the opposite. They may seem extremely pleasant, polite, charismatic. And that's exactly what deceives you. Because you've been conditioned to associate kindness with sincerity. But they're not the same thing. Someone can be incredibly likable, and completely disconnected from who they truly are. And when that happens, something very specific shows up: subtle inconsistency. Not a big contradiction, but small deviations. A tone that doesn't match the expression. A reaction that comes a little too late. Interest that feels intense, but empty. It's almost imperceptible, but you feel it. Yet most of the time, you ignore it. Because you want to believe. Because you want that connection to be real. Because you want that person to be different. And that's exactly what keeps the pattern alive. You notice, but you don't validate what you notice. Jung said that intuition isn't a random guess, it's the unconscious recognizing patterns before the conscious mind understands. And maybe that strange feeling you've had so many times was never an overreaction. Maybe it was perception. But you've learned to doubt it. You've learned to prioritize what seems logical, and ignore what you feel. And that distances you from one of the most powerful tools you have to identify fakeness: your own emotional reading. Because before any rational analysis, your body already noticed. Before any conclusion, something in you already signaled. But you overrode it. And the more you do that, the more disconnected you become from your own perception. And the more vulnerable you become to people who know exactly how to appear as what you expect. So if there's something that can completely change how you identify a fake person in less than a minute, it's not an external technique. It's learning to trust what you feel, before trying to explain what you see. But this raises an even more uncomfortable question. If you already notice these signs, why do you keep ignoring them? If this resonated with you in any way, comment one word, "I notice." Not as a statement, but as a first step toward trusting what you've always felt, but never fully validated. And there's another signal, even more subtle, that shows up right after this first one, and practically gives everything away, if you know where to look. And this second signal, it appears right after that almost imperceptible discomfort. It's as if, after something doesn't quite fit, the person tries to compensate, and it's exactly in that compensation that the fakeness becomes more visible. Because when someone isn't authentic, they need to control how they're perceived. And that creates a very specific behavior, over-adjustment. It's not natural. It doesn't flow. It's like the person is constantly calibrating their image, measuring their words, adjusting their reactions, shaping their personality based on what's in front of them. And here's the most important detail. This happens fast. Very fast. Sometimes in less than a minute. You say something, and they instantly shift their tone to match yours. You express an opinion, and they agree immediately, without reflection. You show interest in something, and suddenly, that becomes part of their world too. At first, this feels like connection. But it's not. It's adaptation. And there's a huge difference between someone who connects with you, and someone who molds themselves to fit you. Connection has naturalness. Adaptation has intention. According to Carl Jung, when a person is overly identified with their persona, they lose touch with who they really are, and begin to exist through the expectations of others. And that creates behavior that, at first glance, looks like empathy, but is actually strategy. Because the person isn't being. They're performing. And this creates a very clear pattern, if you know how to observe. A fake person doesn't reveal who they are, they reveal what you want to see. And the more attention you pay, the more obvious this becomes. You notice they rarely disagree. That they avoid real conflict. That they adjust their story depending on the context. That they always seem too perfect to be real. And the most curious part. At first, this attracts you. Because it feels easy. It feels light. It feels like you've finally found someone who fits you. But that feeling is constructed. It's not spontaneous. And that's exactly why it doesn't last. Because no one can maintain an adjusted version of themselves for long without something slipping. And when it does, it shows up as inconsistency. Small details that don't add up. Responses that don't match actions. Interests that subtly shift. Stories that sound right, but lack depth. And once again, you feel it. But tend to ignore it. Because you're already emotionally invested in the idea of that person. And that's what makes this second sign so dangerous. It doesn't push you away. It pulls you closer. But closer to an illusion. Because the more the person molds themselves to you, the more you feel like you found someone special. When in reality, you're just seeing a reflection of yourself, carefully constructed. And this connects to something even deeper. Because if someone can adapt to you that quickly, it means they're observing. Analyzing. Reading your reactions. And using that as a guide. And that's not emotional connection. That's strategic reading. And maybe now it starts to make sense. Why some people enter your life with such intensity, and then become completely different. Not because they changed, but because, in the beginning, they never showed who they really were. And this raises an even more unsettling question. If someone can adjust so well to you at the beginning, how can you tell when it's real, and when it's just a construction? If this triggered something in you, comment one simple word: adjustment. Because recognizing this pattern is what pulls you out of the illusion, and starts placing you in a much clearer position of perception. And there's a specific moment, inevitable, when this mask truly starts to fail, not in subtle details, but in something much harder to hide. And that moment, it always comes. It might take a little longer, it might start subtly, but it's inevitable. Because no mask, no matter how well built, can stay intact when something goes off script. And that's exactly when you start to see what was hidden. Because while everything is under control, the fake person can maintain the image. They calculate, observe, adjust. But the moment something unexpected happens, a frustration, a contradiction, a boundary, something shifts. And it shifts fast. It's like, for a second, that perfect version disappears, and something more raw, more real, slips through. Sometimes it's a different look. A colder response. A disproportionate irritation. A shift in energy you can't explain, but feel immediately. And this is one of the most powerful signs there is. Because it's not rehearsed. It's not calculated. It's reaction. According to Carl Jung, it's in what escapes conscious control that the shadow reveals itself, the part of the personality that wasn't integrated, that was hidden, repressed, but still exists, influencing everything behind the scenes. And when the persona fails, the shadow appears. Without filters. Without adjustment. Without concern for image. And it's exactly in that moment that you gain access to something that normally wouldn't be shown. But here's the most important point. You've seen this before. You've seen someone suddenly change their behavior. You've felt them become distant, defensive, or even aggressive, without proportional reason. You've noticed that when contradicted, that person who seemed so balanced, reacts in a completely different way. And even then, you tried to explain it. Tried to justify it. Tried to minimize it. Maybe you thought, they were just having a bad day, everyone has their moments, it's no big deal. And that's exactly where the pattern continues. Because you saw it. But you didn't validate what you saw. Because accepting it would mean breaking the image you created of that person. And that creates an internal conflict. Between what you perceive, and what you want to believe. And most of the time, what you want to believe wins. But here's the detail that changes everything. This kind of reaction isn't an isolated mistake. It's a leak. A reflection of something that was already there, but hadn't yet clearly appeared. Because no one sustains a character 100% of the time. At some point, internal pressure leaks out. And when it does, it reveals patterns. How the person deals with frustration. How they react to no. How they treat others when they're no longer benefiting from the interaction. And that says far more about someone than any well-crafted speech. Because words can be shaped. Behavior under pressure can't. And maybe now you're starting to notice something that used to go unnoticed. That strange feeling after certain interactions. That shift in atmosphere you couldn't explain. That internal doubt that showed up, but you quickly ignored. None of that was random. And the more you start observing these moments, the clearer it becomes that they follow a pattern. A pattern that doesn't show up when everything is comfortable. But reveals itself exactly when something goes off script. And this puts you in a completely different position. Because now you no longer depend on what the person shows when they want to impress. You observe who they are when they can't sustain their image. And that opens a new layer of perception. Much more precise. Much more real. But also more uncomfortable. Because seeing this requires you to stop ignoring signs. And maybe, for the first time, you're starting to connect dots that once seemed isolated. If this reminded you of someone, or a specific situation, comment one word, "I've seen it." Because recognizing these moments is what begins to separate perception from illusion. And there's an even more direct behavior, almost impossible to hide, that shows up not when the person is under pressure, but in how they treat people who have nothing to offer. And this behavior is far more direct than any other sign, yet almost always ignored. Because it doesn't happen to you. And that's exactly why you don't notice it. But you should. Because how someone treats people who have nothing to offer reveals who they truly are. Not when they're trying to impress. Not when they want to connect. But when there's nothing to gain. Think about it, when someone doesn't need approval, doesn't need to make a good impression, doesn't need to maintain an image, their behavior becomes more automatic, more raw, closer to the truth. And that's where the mask simply stops making sense. According to Carl Jung, the human ego organizes itself around value, what it perceives as important, useful, relevant. And everything outside of that tends to be treated with less attention, less care, less presence. And that's exactly where fakeness reveals itself. Because someone who completely changes their behavior depending on who they're dealing with, isn't being authentic. They're being strategic. You've seen this before. Maybe in a small detail, but one that stuck with you. Someone who is kind, attentive, present with you, but cold, impatient, or even disrespectful toward a stranger. Someone who shows empathy when there's exchange, but completely ignores those who don't represent immediate value. Someone who smiles at people who can offer something, and changes their tone with those who can't. And this isn't about politeness. It's about consistency. Because authenticity doesn't depend on context. It remains. Fakeness adapts. And that's why this is one of the clearest signs you can notice in less than a minute, if you know where to look. Because while you're focused on your direct interaction, there's a second layer happening around you. How the person observes others. How they react to small situations. How they treat those who aren't part of the game. And all of this happens quickly, almost automatically. Without filters. Without construction. Without any intention to impress. And maybe now you're starting to realize something that was always there. Fake people aren't fake all the time. They're selective. They choose when to perform. Choose when to adapt. Choose when to show their best side. And this creates a very dangerous illusion. Because with you, in that moment, they may seem exactly like what you've always been looking for. But that doesn't mean that's who they are. It just means they chose to be that, in that context. And that completely changes how you interpret people. Because from this point on, it's no longer enough to analyze how someone treats you. You begin to observe how they behave when they don't need you. And that reveals much deeper patterns. You notice inconsistencies. You notice subtle shifts in posture. You notice changes in energy depending on the situation. And all of this gradually dismantles that initial image that once seemed so solid. But there's an even more important detail. Because recognizing this behavior requires something not everyone is willing to do. It requires you to step out of the center. To stop looking only at what you're receiving, and start seeing the whole picture. And that often breaks expectations. Because it means admitting that someone who seems good for you may not be truly good. And that realization can be uncomfortable. But it's also liberating. Because it takes you out of a vulnerable position, and places you in a position of observation. And the more you develop this ability, the faster you recognize patterns that used to take months or years to become clear. And that doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you aware. But here's an even deeper question. If these signs are there, so visible once you know where to look, why do so many people still fall into the exact same patterns? If this resonated with you, comment one simple word: consistency. Because that's what separates appearance from truth, and perception from illusion. And what you're about to realize next may be even more uncomfortable, because the reason may not be only in other people. And this is where most people get stuck, because up to this point, it's comfortable to think the problem is just the other person. That there are fake, manipulative, inconsistent people, and that you just need to learn to identify them faster. But what if it's not just that? What if there's something in you that facilitates this kind of connection? Not consciously, but at a much deeper level. Because according to Carl Jung, we don't just connect with who we want, we connect with what we recognize internally. With emotional patterns that already exist within us, even if they're not fully clear. And that changes everything. Because maybe the reason you notice too late isn't a lack of emotional intelligence, but an excess of emotional expectation. Maybe you want it to be real so badly that you ignore when it's not. Maybe you value connection so much that you overlook inconsistency. Maybe at some point in your life, you learned that you need to invest more, give more, insist more, for something to work. And that creates a pattern. A silent pattern, but an extremely powerful one. Because when someone shows up with quick interest, intensity, alignment, it activates something in you. A sense of recognition. Of familiarity. Of, this is what I've been looking for. But what you're recognizing isn't always truth. Sometimes, it's just a reflection of something you've felt before. Something you've lived. Something that, in some way, was registered as normal. And that's exactly what makes fakeness so effective. It doesn't need to convince you from scratch. It just needs to fit into something you already know. And then, you don't question it. You get involved. You invest. You believe. And when the signs appear, you're already emotionally in. And that makes it harder to leave. Because it's not just about the person. It's about the expectation you created. The story you started building in your mind. The version you wanted to be real. And that's why, many times, you notice, but don't act. You feel, but don't validate. You see, but try to reinterpret. Because accepting the truth requires letting go of the illusion. And emotionally, that has a cost. But here's the most important point. This doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Because all of us, at some level, seek connection. We seek recognition. We seek to feel that someone truly sees us. And fake people know exactly how to access that. They don't create the need. They exploit what's already there. And the more you ignore this within yourself, the more vulnerable you become. But when you start to see this pattern, something shifts. You stop looking only at the other person's behavior, and start observing what it triggers in you. You notice when you're accelerating emotionally. When you're idealizing too quickly. When you're ignoring small signs in exchange for a bigger feeling. And that gives you something very powerful: choice. Because now you're no longer reacting automatically. You observe. You question. You decide. And that breaks the cycle. Because fakeness loses its power when it meets someone aware. Someone who isn't carried away by appearances alone. Someone who doesn't connect only with what they want to feel, but also with what is actually happening. And maybe this is the most uncomfortable, but also the most liberating point of all. Realizing that it's not just about identifying fake people, but understanding why, at some level, you allowed them to stay. If this resonated with you, comment a simple phrase, "I choose to see." Because seeing this isn't about blame, it's about awareness. And there's one final level to this perception, something that completely separates those who keep falling into these patterns, from those who begin to see before the fakeness even fully forms. And this is where everything shifts to another level, because the moment you start seeing these patterns, not just in others, but within yourself, the way you perceive people will never be the same again. You start noticing things that used to go completely unseen. Not because people changed, but because you changed how you observe. It's as if, suddenly, you're no longer stuck only on what's said, but on what's felt, what's coherent, what holds up over time. And this creates an almost instantaneous perception. An emotional reading that happens fast, sometimes in seconds. You enter an interaction and already sense the person's rhythm. You notice whether there's presence, or just performance. You notice whether there's consistency, or adaptation. You notice whether there's truth, or intention. And the most interesting part: you no longer need to prove it to yourself. You feel it. And that's enough. According to Carl Jung, the more you integrate unconscious parts of your own psyche, the clearer your perception of others becomes. Because you stop projecting, and start seeing. And that's what separates those who keep repeating patterns, from those who begin to break them. Because until now, maybe you were always trying to understand after you were already involved. After you had already connected. After you had already invested emotionally. But now, you begin to perceive before. Before creating expectations. Before idealizing. Before giving yourself away. And that completely changes the game. Because fakeness depends on time. Time to build. Time to involve you. Time to sustain itself until you're emotionally in. But when you develop this level of awareness, that time disappears. Because you no longer need weeks, or days, or hours. You notice in minutes. Sometimes, in less than a minute. And not because you've become suspicious. But because you've become attentive. And there's a huge difference between those two states. Suspicion pushes away. Awareness reveals. Because you're not judging. You're observing. You're not reacting out of fear. You're perceiving with clarity. And that brings a very specific feeling. Inner control. Emotional security. No longer depending on external validation to understand what's happening. And that is power. Not power over others. But over yourself. Over your choices. Over what you allow. Over what you accept. And the more you stay in that place, the more natural it becomes. You don't need to force it. You don't need to overanalyze. You don't need to constantly look for signs. Because perception becomes automatic. And that completely changes the kind of people who remain in your life. Because fake people need someone who doesn't see. Who ignores. Who doubts themselves. And when they meet someone who perceives, they can't sustain it. They either pull away. Or reveal themselves. And in both cases, you gain clarity. But there's one last detail, almost invisible, that determines whether you'll sustain this level of awareness, or eventually fall back into old patterns. If this resonated with you, comment one word, awareness. Because this is where everything truly begins to change. And what comes next, is what separates those who only understand, from those who never go back to the same place again. And if you made it this far, it wasn't by chance. Because this kind of content doesn't hold just anyone. It only holds those who, at some level, recognized something, who felt discomfort, who realized they may have ignored signs that were always there. So tell me, did this reflect what you feel? If so, comment something simple like, "I see it now." Sometimes everything begins the moment you stop running from what you already perceive. And if this video opened your mind, if you feel like you're starting to see people differently, then you need to keep developing this awareness. Subscribe to the channel now, especially if you're one of the people who made it to the end, because that already shows you don't want to live on autopilot anymore. Here, you won't find shallow content. You'll understand human behavior, emotional patterns, fakeness, connection, everything that completely changes how you relate to the world. Now, leave a like on the video. It may seem simple, but it helps this message reach more people who are being deceived without realizing it, just like you may have been one day. And if someone came to mind while you were watching, someone who needs to open their eyes, share this video with them. Because sometimes, a single insight at the right moment changes everything. And if you want to go even deeper, there's a next video that will show you why some people can manipulate others' emotions so effectively, and how to protect yourself from it before you even realize it. That's the next step. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next video.